His picture not only hangs in nearly every Lutheran parsonage, but is also displayed on beer and liquor bottles, on keyrings, T-shirts, on cups, glasses, and toothpick boxes. Thousands of streets in Germany bear his name, and in many towns and cities monuments with his person decorate important squares. Cities in which Martin Luther lived and worked, as well as his birthplace, call themselves Luther cities. Thousands and thousands of people are drawn every year to several of these places, to see his residence with its Luther parlor, for instance. Every year, over 300,000 make a pilgrimage to the Wartburg in Eisenach, Thuringia, to have a look at his former study with its old desk, or to the less-known whale vertebra on which he allegedly once placed his feet. The Protestant Lutheran Church, which venerates him as its founder, has approximately 24 million followers in Germany alone. But do the Lutherans really know his teachings? Or are a part of his statements swept under the carpet? There are many books and films about Luther. However, in this documentation, we want to above all show that side of Luther that remains mostly hidden to the faithful, and that even Protestant Lutheran theologians seldom or never get to see. Let's briefly look back at the beginning of the Reformation at the start of the 16th century. Everyone has surely heard of the 95 Theses which the Augustinian monk Martin Luther nailed to the doors of the castle church in Wittenberg, at that time the capital city of the Duchy of Saxony. This act marks the hour of birth of the later Protestant Lutheran Church. Among other things, Luther pilloried the Catholic Church's practice of indulgences, which prevailed at that time. For him, it was a scandal that for money one could allegedly shorten one's punishment for sin or even the time of suffering of the deceased in purgatory. At first, the young Luther appeared to be very pugnacious. When in 1520 a papal bull threatened him with excommunication, he publicly burned it. But then he had to fear for his life. He had to flee and go into hiding. Luther changed his name, and under the pseudonym Junker Jörg found refuge on the Wartburg in Eisenach, where he was under the protection of the mighty Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. Until today, his study with the aforementioned whale vertebrae is there, and is still a great point of attraction. It was in this room that he is said to have started translating the Bible into German. During his lifetime, Luther wrote many works on various theological topics, but also on topics of daily life, for example, against gluttony and other vices, most likely not suspecting that later he himself would be suffering under these. And while the young Luther did not shy away from any dispute with the Catholic Church, later on more and more prone to obesity and not adverse to alcohol, Luther later sought an alliance with another authority, namely the ruling princes. And he relentlessly fought against all those who did not fit into his mindscape, in which the princes and the church should represent the left and right hand of God and see to order with a stricter hand. Thus, to Luther in his mind, Jews, Turks, Anabaptists, freethinkers, and finally also the peasants turned more and more into enemies of his secular thinking oriented towards authority. As time passed, his statements and his way of expressing himself became ever coarser, and his statements grew ever further away from the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, whom he pretended to represent. For better understanding, we want to compare several quotes from Luther's writings with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. In various writings, Martin Luther urged the princes to kill the rebellious peasants. For example, he wrote, "Such strange things are here that a people can earn heaven with bloodshed rather than others, usually with praying. Stab, beat, throttle here, whoever can. If you remain dead in the process, happy you! You can never attain a more blessed death. for you die obedient to the divine word and command. It is clear that here Luther was calling for murder and teaching that one was more likely to go to heaven with killing than with praying, an obvious contradiction to the peaceful teachings of Jesus, which as a consequence of Luther's increasing importance had terrible consequences. Nearly 100,000 people fell victim to the massacre of the peasants that followed Luther's call, including countless non-participants. Several of the peasant leaders were hanged head down by Luther's adherents and then slowly sawed apart from testicles to belly button until they perished under the most agonizing pain. But let's go back again. What did Jesus of Nazareth teach? If you would enter life, keep the commandments. You shall not kill. He taught reconciliation and generosity in cases of conflict, and Jesus also taught, come to terms with your accuser quickly while you are on the way with him. And he even said, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And so the discrepancy between Luther's words and the teachings of Jesus is obvious. His call for the relentless eradication of the rebels practically gave the princes a license for every kind of cruelty. Luther was indeed aware that thousands of people were brutally killed due to his rabble-rousing speeches, for he later confessed, "Preachers are the greatest killers of all, for they admonish the authorities that they should administer their office with resolution and punish the pests. I have killed all the farmers in the rebellion. All their blood is on my neck. But I lay the blame on our good Lord. He ordered me to say such things. All their blood is on my head." Thus Luther, literally. Yet he wasn't to blame for the massacre, but God. He wanted it so. God ordered him to proclaim these calls to murder and manslaughter. Luther's original criticism of the popes and the Catholic Church had thus caught up with him. He himself was not one bit better than the Catholic Church, which during nearly the whole time of its existence called upon the state authorities to commit murder, manslaughter, and oppression. For instance, during the 13th century, it had the rebellion of the Stedinga peasant farmers in northern Germany mercilessly crushed with a crusade and corresponding massacres. But let's compare more words of the reformer Martin Luther with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, this time on soldiering. For the hand that guides the sword and kills is then no longer the hand of a human being, but the hand of God, and not of the person. Instead, God hangs, breaks on the wheel, decapitates, kills, and leads the war, for all things are his works and his court. At the latest, the question inevitably comes up here. Which God does Luther mean here? Obviously, not the God whom Jesus of Nazareth taught us, for Jesus taught, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who insult and persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven." But how can this obvious discrepancy between Martin Luther's statements and the teachings of Jesus be explained? Did Martin Luther lose his conscience? It can be that Luther's dissolute way of life contributed to this. It is reported that at every meal he drank nearly 2 liters of fortified wine, and in between meals, plenty of Neuenburgisch beer. In the Luther House Museum in Wittenberg, for instance, a contemporary drawing is shown with the title "Spiritual Boozing Duel." Here Luther is seen with a large pitcher of wine, and it is known that back then as today, such amounts of alcohol can contribute to dulling the conscience and disinhibition in the use of violence. A sober and reflective person, that is, a person who still has control of his senses, would never bring another to the gallows in the name of Christ. One of the most far-reaching and tragic lapses are Luther's writings against the Jews. He repeatedly defamed the Jewish population and openly demanded their persecution and murder. A quote, "That one forbids them, with us, to publicly praise God, to thank, to pray, to teach by loss of body and life. And, if I could, I would cut him." Luther meant the Jewish fellow citizen. "I would cut him down, and in my rage bore through him with the sword. These good-for-nothings and pillagers are worthy of neither grace nor pity." From the pulpit in the church of Eisleben, his place of birth and death, for instance, Luther spread the following truly abysmal horror stories about them. Quote, "The wicked Jew will not cease sucking you dry, and when he can, killing you. The Jews can administer medicine from which he, the patient, must die in an hour, in a month, in a year, even in 10 or 20 years. They have the cunning." This is what Luther preached, only a few steps away from his home, where he died a few days after this sermon. In the treatise on the Jews and their lies, Luther outrightly described in a 7-point plan the so-called sharp mercy, how one should, in his opinion, deal with the Jews, to discharge the Jewish burden as he expressed it. First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed, for they pursue in them the same aims as in their synagogues. Instead, they might be lodged under a roof or in a barn. Third, I advise that all their prayer books be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews, for they have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, tradesmen, or the like. Let them stay at home. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them, and put aside for safekeeping. Seventh, I commend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. Luther preached anti-Semitism in its purest form, and thus 400 years later became the spiritual role model for Hitler's Holocaust. Hitler himself remarked, quote, "Luther was a great man, a giant. With one leap he broke through the twilight and saw the Jews, as we are only beginning to see them today." End of quote. It hardly needs to be pointed out that all this has not the slightest thing in common with Jesus of Nazareth, but represents the exact opposite of his peaceful teachings. Another terrible call for murder by Martin Luther is directed against Turkish opponents to war. According to his words, proper Christians are loyal subjects who, quote, "raise their fist in joy and with confidence, beat, murder, rob, and do harm as much as they can." And also this time he didn't forget to add what in his opinion would be the reward for those who die in this fight, namely, quote, blessed and holy eternally. But as if that weren't enough, Luther also urged death for usurers. Quote, as one breaks on the wheel and beheads the street robbers, murderers, how much more shall one break on the wheel and bleed all usurers and chase away, curse and behead all skinflints? The torture methods that Luther so stridently demanded belong to the cruelest and most painful that sick brains have ever thought up. For example, with the wheel, which was usually also equipped with blades, the bones of all victims were broken on a large wooden wheel, so that afterward the broken members could be wrapped around the spokes of a large wheel. Then, with a victim on it, who was suffering under unimaginable pain, the wheel was attached to a wooden post on which the tortured person slowly found death during the following hours, days, or weeks. With bloodletting, the arteries of the victim, who was shackled to a special board, were slightly cut so that he slowly and agonizingly bled to death. On the other hand, no violence against usurers has been passed down from Jesus, but rather that he even visited usurers or deceivers, which amazed and angered the priests at that time. Never did he condemn a sinner. Instead, he urged him to change his ways. Often the following argument is used to excuse Luther. That's just how things were back then. But then, how can we explain that such spiritually open-minded and sensitive people as Erasmus of Rotterdam, the Zwickauer prophets, and many others were living at the same time, and also the Anabaptists, whom Luther equally had persecuted and killed, lived with their neighbors a peaceful life devoted to God? So during that time, one did not have to inevitably become brutalized and even incite people to murder and manslaughter, much less when one claimed to be a man of God. Adulterers also belonged to the groups of people for whom Luther urged death. Luther literally. It would be better. Kill him. It is the fault of the authorities. Why does one not kill the adulterer? And he also demanded death by torture for prostitutes. Quote, if I were a judge, I would want to have such a French poisonous whore broken on the wheel and bled. Here too the teachings of Jesus are in crass contrast. Think of the well-known words of Jesus to the adulteress. Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more. And Jesus also addressed the scribes. And these words must also have been well known to Luther, a scholar and translator of the Bible. Truly, I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. Often midwives or healers who knew the medicinal plants of nature got a bad name as sorcerers and charlatans. Luther also made short work of them. Quote, you shall not let the sorceresses live. It is a just law that they are killed. This call for the murder of women, most likely because they could help many through their knowledge, thus being superior to many a priest, had devastating consequences. Wherever Luther's faith became established, even more women proportionally were tortured and burned at the stake than in Catholic regions. It was thousands and thousands who died a terrible death. Here, too, Luther did not bring reformation, but on the contrary, even intensified the Catholic calamity. It is certain that Luther could have improved the lot of many women. After all, he did pass himself off as a man of God, and as we know, Jesus of Nazareth always urged mercy and did not threaten anyone with torture and death, but instead of this, from the pulpit, Luther called for torture and killing of women as well, and that with terrible consequences. But now the question is due, to for once impartially judge the figure Martin Luther, the Reformer, by his works, and to reevaluate him accordingly. Under such circumstances, is it still ethically justifiable today to name streets after such a person, for instance? But Martin Luther not only urged to break on the wheel, to bloodlet, to behead, and to burn people of various population groups. Death by drowning could also be found on his murderous list, and that to handicap children of all people. With a certain degree of disability, Luther recommended drowning a child. For such a child is merely a soulless piece of flesh laid in the cradle by Satan, which then does not flourish, but only eats and drinks. Shouldn't the admonishing words of Jesus have rung in Martin Luther's ears here too? See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. A special thorn in Luther's side was dissenters, or people who did not submit to his teachings and instructions. In particular, these included the adherents of the Anabaptist movement. These people strictly held to the teaching of Jesus: teach first and then baptize. For this reason, they did not have their children baptized in church. Instead, they were first taught, and if they wanted this, were later baptized as responsible adults. That these people thus defied Luther's instructions and the newly drafted order for church and society done by him could not be accepted by him under any circumstances, even though from the viewpoint of the Bible the Anabaptists were in the right. Luther had the Anabaptists mercilessly persecuted and killed because from his point of view they disturbed the official state church order, which for him was the same as rebellion, even though these people lived totally peaceably. They were considered rabble-rousers, and I quote, "Therefore, without doubt, the authority is obligated and should, with physical violence and according to the circumstances, also punish with the sword." May a brief example demonstrate what terrible consequences Luther's diatribes had against the Anabaptists. A story that is representative for countless similar fates. An Anabaptist named Fritz Erbe was a prisoner from 1540 to 1548 in the South Tower of the Wartburg, 20 years after Luther started translating the Bible into German in this castle. After refusing to have his newborn child baptized and refusing to comply with, according to Luther, being forbidden to take in a persecuted person of like mind into his house, the farmer who lived in the village Herda near Eisenach had been arrested in 1533. First kept captive in a tower dungeon in the city walls, Erbe was transferred to the Wartburg in 1540 because public solidarity with the prisoner caused fear of unrest. Despite an attempt to convert him, Fritz Erbe stood fast to his Christian but non-church faith. These tower dungeons were also called an oubliette. Thousands of women, supposed witches, are said to have been locked in such oubliettes at that time, where they mostly, in utter darkness and with prison food, vegetated toward their slow and agonizing end. Most oubliettes were merely equipped with a small opening in the roof, through which a normally grown person could squeeze after a fashion. As soon as this opening was shut, total darkness prevailed. This circumstance drove many prisoners to insanity due to fear. An oubliette was sometimes up to 10 meters or more under the earth's surface and was normally opened only to throw down food scraps or personal excretions of the guards. It is therefore superfluous to mention that the condemned person had to live in the midst of his own excretions too. An unfortunate situation that, among other things, attracted masses of vermin. But how can one describe the character of a person who does such terrible things to another or who prescribes or recommends such punishments to the state authorities, or tolerates this with satisfaction? Interesting in this connection is that dissidents or Christians who do not keep to the church regulations and laws, that is, who want to follow solely Christ and not the churches, are still a big thorn in the side of the Protestant Lutheran Church. Parallels to the behavior of Luther toward the Anabaptists cannot be overlooked, even though the present-day Lutheran sect commissioners no longer burn people at the stake. Even today, however, lies and horror stories are still spread about dissidents, and these people are branded with the disparaging word sect, fully aware of what this means in society. Television stations and high-circulation newspapers and magazines often willingly lend support to the Protestant Lutheran Church, for instance, when it's about warning people against shopping at sectarians who offer homegrown vegetables at a market stand. The economic damages that develop for the market people due to this are not an issue. Just like in Luther's time, such committed and peaceable people are considered by the Church to be a disturbance to the Church's and state's system of rule and are socially ostracized and branded. But the influence of the churches is constantly decreasing. Only 3% of Lutheran Germans still actively participate in church life. If the state wouldn't subsidize the two mainstream churches in Germany with approximately 15 billion euros, they would surely have problems keeping up their social position of power. However, the German state continues to finance the education of theologians as well as the salaries of church leaders, even though, according to its constitution, it should be ideologically neutral. And considering the mindset of the founder father of the Protestant Lutheran Church, Martin Luther, a most questionable behavior. In any case, these days a person who consumes several liters of alcoholic drinks every day and publicly calls for murder and manslaughter would certainly be taken into custody, put before the court, or would disappear into an asylum if he so ranted and raved in public as did the religious leader Martin Luther. And until today, the Protestant Lutheran Church has not dissociated itself from Martin Luther. On the contrary, particularly in the present time, it is planning on celebrating big anniversary events and continues to venerate Luther while trivializing his calls for murder and his brutal mindset as the only dark side of Luther, which does simply happen sometimes in a person, always in the hope that essential parts of Luther's writings can still be hushed up and kept secret from the faithful and even from prospective theologians. For this reason, only few know that in his delusion of thinking he had to fight against dissenters, Luther even continued with several tragic and fatal steps. In his writings, Martin Luther indicated executions without trials for Christians who did not 100% condone his teachings. Luther was of the opinion that the authorities should also punish those who teach that Christ did not die for the sins of all people, but that each person himself bears the responsibility for his actions. As justification, he referred to Moses, who in his law supposedly had ordered that such blasphemers, yes, all false teachers, be stoned. Luther literally said, "And so one should not dispute much here, but should damn without a hearing and without taking responsibility such public blasphemy." So here Luther demanded the damnation and punishment of people who virtually put the words of Jesus into practice and wanted to live according to his teachings in their daily lives. But where did Jesus urge that his disciples should attack and kill others who wanted to follow him? He clearly said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So a clear and serious contradiction to Luther's teachings. Even Luther's most important theological statement that faith alone is enough for salvation utterly contradicts the teachings of Jesus. Quote from Luther, "And so in us we are sinners, and nevertheless, as long as God sees us as righteous, righteous through the belief." In another place, Martin Luther wrote similarly to his colleague campaigner, Philip Melanchthon, "Sin boldly, but believe even more boldly." Behind this is Luther's idea that a person always has to somehow or other sin. Figuratively speaking, these statements are like a slap in the Nazarene's face, whose teachings Luther allegedly represented, according to Luther's statements, for Jesus taught people how they could put aside their sins step by step, until one day they would again be as perfect as God once created them. So spoke Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And as we know, Jesus also explained that only the doing of his teachings is important, not the belief. Quote, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." And in another passage, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock." And further, "And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand." Thus, the doing of his teachings is the central fulcrum in the teachings of Jesus, and it is exactly this cornerstone that Martin Luther levers out. He taught the opposite, just like the Catholic Church. Doesn't the question arise here? How can such a serious distortion of Jesus' teachings form the foundation of a Christian church right up until today? To what extent can one call Luther's teachings Christian at all when they so obviously contradict the most important points of the teachings of Jesus? But then, to what extent can one still call Martin Luther a Christian? If one studies Luther's writings, one always comes to the same conclusion, that everything and each person who contradict in his thoughts should be eliminated, and that often using the cruelest and bloodiest methods. He also foresaw the same cruelties for the Catholic Pope and his bishops. Literally, he urged, quote, "Just as we punish thieves with rope, murderers with sword, heretics with fire, why do we not much more attack these noxious teachers of corruption like popes, cardinals, bishops, and the entire ulceration of Roman sodomy with all sorts of weapons and wash our hands in their blood?" And further, "One should tear out the tongues of the Pope and the Curia all the way back to the throat, and should nail them like seals on the papal bulls according to order of precedence on the gallows." It's true that Luther pilloried and pointed out that on the whole, the Pope, the cardinals, and the bishops and the teachers of the Catholic Church had nothing to do with Christ and his teachings. But then, is it any different with him? Luther knew very well the words of Jesus on the law of cause and effect. "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." But apparently these words did not seem to especially impress or bother the reformer, for he saw himself in the proper way of seeing the teachings of Jesus. Yes, he even raised his own teachings to divine teachings, and even declared himself judge of the angels. Quote, "I want my teaching to be unjudged by everyone, also by all angels. For since I am certain of it, I will be your judge and also that of the angels, as St. Paul says, so that the one who does not accept my teachings may not become blessed, for it is God's and not mine. Therefore my court is also God's and not mine." And so Luther unmistakably declared that he himself represented the right word of God without fail. Thus, in the following, he also urged the death penalty for preachers who could not prove ordination by an official church. Quote, "Even if they wanted to teach the pure gospel, indeed, even if they were like angels and Gabriel from heaven, if he wants to preach, then he must prove the calling or order. If he does not want to, then the authorities should hand over such scoundrels to the proper master, who is called the hangman." And indirectly, Luther threatened with the death penalty every citizen who did not immediately report such a preacher to the vicars. If I may say so, how many liters of red wine and how much beer does it take until the spirit out of the bottle becomes master and inspirer? Jesus, namely, was definitely tolerant in dealing with other preachers. The following episode is found in the Gospel of Mark. "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us. But Jesus said, 'Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me, for the one who is not against us is for us.'" Don't such words of Jesus sound like heavenly music after so many Lutheran dissonances and outbursts of violence? Luther apparently thought that he pleased God with his angry and in part bloodthirsty speeches. Quote, "My dear Creator and Father, you will graciously see it as good that I must talk so despicably against your accursed enemies, devils and Jews. You know that I do it out of the heat of my faith and to honor your divine majesty." Jesus had already predicted that later people would kill his disciples and would thereby believe that they were doing God a favor. It literally says in John, "Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God." In a central tenet, Luther also represented the viewpoint that man has no free will at all in decisive questions of faith and life. In somewhat unusual images, he said, "In this way the human will is put right between the two, God and Satan, just like a riding animal. When God sits upon it, it wants and goes where God wants to. When Satan sits upon it, it wants and goes where Satan wants to. And it does not have the freedom to decide, to run to one of the riders or to seek him. It is self-evident that Jesus behaved in a different way, since he invited the people to follow him of their free will. He called to those seeking, 'Follow me,' and 'Seek, and you will find.' Strictly speaking, what Luther taught, on the other hand, even contradicts current human rights and the constitution of democratic states. However, Martin Luther was convinced that with all his violent talking and acting, he was acting as God wanted, and would therefore go directly to heaven. And not only he, but all theologians with him. He was not so sure about jurists. Quote, "It is very questionable whether jurists become blessed, for it is indeed even hard for the theologians, even though the theologians are already righteous and in heaven. It is certain that Jesus would have described such actions differently, and as the Son of God, he was definitely light years closer to the truth when he said, 'But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in.'" Another odd statement of Luther's reads, according to his table talk, as follows, "I have no better medicine than anger. For if I want to write, pray, and preach well, then I have to be angry. Then all my blood refreshes itself, my mind becomes sharpened, and all temptations recede." However, very many people had to lose their lives due to Luther's outbursts of rage, and it's certain that Luther's viewpoint has nothing to do with the peaceful teachings of Jesus. As we know, Jesus said, quote, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not kill,' and whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Is not any other word superfluous here? Perhaps anyone who still venerates Martin Luther today did not know all these statements by Luther until now, so most people could hardly have been aware that they venerate a man who repeatedly called for murder and manslaughter, who despised women and had them burned as witches, who preached the most evil anti-Semitism, thus even becoming the spiritual herald for Hitler's Holocaust. Even though many may think that Luther's demands are all in the past anyway, it must, however, be called to mind that still at the turn of the year in 1944, the president of the Thuringia Protestant Lutheran Church, Hugo Runk, declared, I quote, "We have been admonished by Martin Luther's legacy for centuries. Such strange times are here that a people can earn heaven with bloodshed rather than others, usually with praying, Heil Hitler." End of quote. And so here in 1944, nearly 400 years after Luther's death, his diatribes are quoted, thus even justifying the murder of millions of people. And this legacy of Luther will continue to exist as long as this man is venerated as a great German, even though in our time much is swept under the carpet. Would it not be urgently necessary to finally reappraise and make public the dark chapters of Luther's works, which would have to mean that the Lutheran Church would have to consistently dissociate itself from Luther and his disputed and non-Christian actions if it wants to assume a positive role in the shaping of our democratic society? If this does not take place, who will assume the guarantee that in a future serious social conflict, similar things will not happen again, and violence against innocent people is again justified with Luther's teachings? Perhaps we should all become aware of the words of the Nazarene regarding this. He said, "I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him." Could not this prophecy also be applicable when Christians still identify with the name of Luther and call themselves Lutheran? And if the Lutheran Church and its adherents want to continue calling themselves Lutheran and to live as Lutherans, aside from a few dark sides that one recognizes as such, is it then correct that they call themselves Christian? What would Jesus say to this? What all has already taken place as injustice in the name of Christ, and how long shall it continue this way?